What happened in that courtroom will be talked about for years. Judge Andrew Napolitano thought he could silence Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with a contempt fine during her testimony about voting rights. The 74-year-old former Fox News legal analyst, now sitting on the federal bench, looked down at the 43-year-old Texas Democrat with complete confidence. He had no idea what was coming next. "You're out of order, Congresswoman," Napolitano declared, his voice echoing through the packed courthouse. "I'm fining you $500 for contempt of this court." The room went dead silent. Crockett, a former civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, slowly stood up. What she said next didn't just shock everyone in that courtroom. It may have ended Napolitano's judicial career forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these explosive political moments. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. buzzed with tension that Tuesday morning. Media crews lined the hallway, reporters clutching notebooks, camera operators checking their equipment one final time. The marble corridors echoed with hushed conversations and the clicking of high heels on polished floors. Security guards directed the steady stream of lawyers, journalists, and political staffers toward courtroom 12, where history was about to be made. Everyone knew this hearing about voting rights legislation would be explosive. The Protecting Voting Rights Act had been the subject of heated debate for months, with Democrats pushing for stronger federal oversight of state election laws, and Republicans arguing it represented government overreach. But nobody, absolutely nobody, expected what was about to unfold between Judge Andrew Napolitano and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for drama. Just weeks earlier, several states had passed new voting restrictions that civil rights groups called the most aggressive suppression efforts since the Jim Crow era. The congressional hearings were supposed to provide a forum for expert testimony, but they had already become a political battlefield where every exchange was analyzed for partisan advantage. To understand why this confrontation became so devastating, you need to know who these two powerful figures really are, and why this moment was always going to be a powder keg waiting to explode. For years he was Fox News' go-to legal analyst, the man who explained constitutional law to millions of viewers with his stern demeanor and unwavering confidence. His nightly appearances on The Ingraham Angle and Tucker Carlson Tonight made him a household name among conservatives, who valued his seemingly unshakable devotion to constitutional principles. When Trump appointed him to the federal bench in his final months, it seemed like the perfect capstone to a career built on conservative legal principles. The confirmation hearing had been surprisingly smooth, with even some Democratic senators praising his legal knowledge, though they questioned his media commentary record. Napolitano's background screams establishment credibility. Georgetown Law School, decades as a Superior Court judge in New Jersey, best-selling books on constitutional law including Constitutional Chaos and The Constitution in Exile. He's the kind of judge who believes in order, hierarchy, and the absolute authority of the bench. His courtroom runs like clockwork. Lawyers speak when spoken to, witnesses answer questions directly, and nobody, absolutely nobody, challenges his authority. His colleagues describe him as meticulous, demanding, and utterly convinced of his own legal brilliance. Former clerks tell stories of his legendary temper when anyone dared to question his interpretations of law. One former clerk anonymously told a legal publication, "Judge Napolitano doesn't just think he's right, he thinks disagreeing with him is a moral failing." But there's something else about Napolitano that makes this story even more explosive. Despite his conservative credentials, he's had a complicated relationship with Trump and MAGA Republicans. He's criticized Trump's legal strategies, questioned his understanding of constitutional law, and often found himself at odds with the very movement that helped put him on the bench. This tension would prove crucial to understanding what happened in that courtroom. On the other side stands Jasmine Crockett, and she's everything the old guard fears about the new generation of Democratic politicians. At 43, the Texas Congresswoman represents a new breed of political fighter, young, brilliant, unafraid, and absolutely unwilling to back down from anyone. Crockett's story is the American dream with a twist. Growing up in Missouri, she worked her way through college and law school, becoming a civil rights attorney who took on cases everyone said she couldn't win. She specialized in police brutality cases, voting rights violations, and standing up for people who had been silenced by the system. Her law practice in Texas became legendary among civil rights activists. She won a $2.8 million settlement against the Dallas Police Department for excessive force. She successfully challenged gerrymandered district maps that diluted minority voting power. Most famously, she represented a group of college students who had been arrested for voter registration activities, not only getting the charges dropped, but exposing a coordinated effort to suppress student voting. Jasmine doesn't just practice law, said Sherilyn Ifill, former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She wields it like a surgical instrument to cut through injustice. When she won her congressional seat in 2022, defeating a Republican incumbent in a district that had been redrawn to favor conservatives, political insiders knew she was different. This wasn't just another politician. This was someone who had spent her entire career fighting powerful people and winning. Her campaign had been a masterclass in grassroots organizing and legal strategy. When Republicans tried to challenge her eligibility based on residency requirements, she not only defeated their legal challenges, but used their attacks to mobilize voters who felt the system was rigged against them. Her victory speech on election night became legendary among Democratic activists. They tried to silence me in court, and we answered at the ballot box. During her first year in Congress, she'd already made a name for herself with her sharp questioning during committee hearings. A viral video of her questioning a banking CEO about predatory lending practices had been viewed over 50 million times. Her colleagues quickly learned that underestimating her preparation was a career-limiting mistake. But what makes Crockett truly dangerous to people like Napolitano is her combination of legal expertise and political fearlessness. She knows the law as well as any judge, but she also knows how to connect with people, how to make complex legal issues feel personal and urgent. She's not intimidated by robes, gavels, or fancy titles. Her colleagues often joke that she's the only member of Congress who actually reads the fine print of every bill and remembers it months later when it matters most. The hearing that brought them together was about the Protecting Voting Rights Act, a piece of legislation that would restore key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court had gutted. Crockett had been invited to testify about voting suppression in Texas, bringing with her a binder full of evidence that Republican legislators were systematically making it harder for people of color to vote. For Napolitano, this was supposed to be a routine hearing. Ask some questions, maintain order, maybe make a few pointed comments about federal overreach. He'd handled hundreds of these hearings over his career. For Crockett, this was personal. She'd seen firsthand how voting restrictions affected her constituents. She'd fought these battles in courtrooms across Texas. She wasn't coming to this hearing to play nice or follow protocol. She was coming to expose the truth, no matter who it made uncomfortable. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about one piece of legislation. It was about the future of voting rights in America. It was about whether the old guard could maintain control over the narrative, or whether a new generation of leaders would force uncomfortable truths into the light. The hearing started exactly how Napolitano expected. Formal introductions, procedural motions, the usual Washington theater. He sat behind his massive wooden bench, looking down at the witness table where Crockett sat with her thick binder of evidence. Everything was going according to plan. Congresswoman Crockett, Napolitano began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected over decades. You've made some very serious allegations about voting restrictions in Texas. I hope you have substantial evidence to back up these claims. Crockett looked up at him, her expression calm but focused. Your Honor, I have extensive documentation of systematic voting suppression affecting over 200,000 voters in my district alone. I'll be the judge of what constitutes evidence in my courtroom, Napolitano replied, a slight edge creeping into his voice. Please stick to facts, not political rhetoric. The first warning sign flashed across Crockett's face, a slight narrowing of her eyes that anyone who'd faced her in court would recognize. But she kept her composure, opening her binder with deliberate precision. Of course, Your Honor. Let me start with documented cases of polling locations being closed without proper notice, disproportionately affecting communities of color. As Crockett began presenting her evidence, something unexpected started happening. Her testimony wasn't the typical political grandstanding Napolitano was used to hearing. This was a former civil rights attorney methodically building a case, citing specific statutes, referencing precedent, presenting evidence with surgical precision. In Harris County alone, Crockett continued, we documented 47 polling locations that were closed between 2020 and 2024. with 89% of those closures occurring in zip codes with majority-minority populations. Congresswoman Napolitano interrupted. Correlation is not causation. You can't simply assume I'm not assuming anything, Your Honor, Crockett cut him off smoothly. I'm presenting statistical analysis that shows a clear pattern of discriminatory intent, backed by internal communications from state election officials that we obtained through FOIA requests. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Democratic members leaned forward, sensing something significant was building. The media section buzzed with whispered conversations. Napolitano's jaw tightened. In his courtroom experience, witnesses, especially political witnesses, didn't usually come this prepared, and they certainly didn't interrupt him. Behind him, his law clerk frantically typed notes, trying to keep up with the rapid-fire exchange. Court reporters later said they'd never seen a witness cite case law with such fluency during what was supposed to be a simple congressional hearing. Several seasoned legal observers in the gallery began texting colleagues that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Furthermore, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength, we have documented evidence that these closures were coordinated through a systematic plan developed by... That's enough. Napolitano's voice boomed through the courtroom. Congresswoman, you're turning my courtroom into a political rally. I asked for facts, not conspiracy theories. The room went electric. Crockett slowly closed her binder, her movements deliberate and controlled. When she looked up at Napolitano, there was fire in her eye. Your Honor, with all due respect, everything I've presented is documented fact. Internal emails, statistical analyses, sworn affidavits from affected voters. If you're uncomfortable with the truth, that says more about your judicial philosophy than my testimony. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Nobody, absolutely nobody, talked to Judge Napolitano like that in his own courtroom. The media section erupted in furious note-taking. Republican committee members looked stunned. Democratic members tried to hide their smile. Napolitano's face flushed red. His knuckles went white as he gripped his gavel. This young congresswoman had just questioned his judicial philosophy in front of a packed courtroom and live television camera. Congresswoman Crockett, his voice was ice-cold now. You seem to have forgotten where you are. This is a federal courtroom, not the House floor. I will not tolerate your disrespectful tone. Crockett stood up slowly, her 5'4" frame somehow seeming to fill the entire courtroom. Your Honor, I've been nothing but respectful. I've presented evidence in a clear, logical manner. If you find facts disrespectful, perhaps we need to examine why that is. The room was completely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting to see what would happen next. I'm going to ask you one more time, Napolitano's voice was shaking with barely controlled anger, to limit your testimony to factual evidence without editorial commentary. Everything I've said has been factual evidence, Crockett replied, her voice steady as steel. The internal emails showing coordination between state officials to close polling sites in minority communities. That's fact. The statistical analysis showing discriminatory impact. That's fact. The sworn testimony from voters who were disenfranchised. That's... Which of these facts would you like me to stop presenting? That's when Napolitano made the mistake that would define this entire confrontation. Instead of recognizing that he was facing a legal mind as sharp as his own, instead of acknowledging that Crockett was presenting legitimate evidence that deserved serious consideration, he fell back on the one thing he thought would silence her, the absolute power of his position. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, raising his gavel, you are out of order. Your disrespectful attitude toward this court is unacceptable. I'm holding you in contempt and fining you $500. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. For a moment, nobody moved. The gravity of what had just happened was sinking in. A federal judge had just held a sitting congresswoman in contempt for presenting evidence about voting rights violations. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing or looking embarrassed, Jasmine Crockett smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a nervous smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed exactly what they needed. The moment Judge Napolitano brought down that gavel, the entire dynamic in the courtroom shifted. What he thought would be the end of Jasmine Crockett's disruptive testimony had actually just become the beginning of his worst night. Crockett remained standing, that confident smile never leaving her face. The $500 contempt fine hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the courtroom sensed that something explosive was about to happen. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice now carrying a different quality, still respectful, but with an underlying steel that made everyone lean forward. "I accept your contempt citation, but before we proceed I have a few questions about the legal basis for this ruling." Napolitano's eyebrows shot up. "Congresswoman, you don't get to question my legal rulings in my own courtroom." "Actually, Your Honor, I do." Crockett's voice was calm, measured, but there was something in her tone that made the entire room hold its breath. As a member of Congress with constitutional immunity under the speech or debate clause, and as a licensed attorney in good standing, I have both the right and the obligation to question any ruling that appears to violate constitutional principles. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Republican committee members started frantically texting their legal teams. Democratic members sat forward in their chairs, realizing they were about to witness something historic. Napolitano's face went from red to pale in seconds. The Speech or Debate Clause, Article 1, Section 6 of the Constitution, protects members of Congress from being questioned about their legislative speech in any other place. Every law student learns about it, but most people forget about its implications in situations like this. Furthermore, Crockett continued, pulling a different folder from her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon selecting the right instrument, "I'd like to address the constitutional issues with your ruling. Under Grav 606, the Supreme Court held that the Speech or Debate Clause protects congressional speech that is an integral part of the deliberative and communicative processes by which members participate in committee and House proceedings." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "My testimony here today at voting rights legislation currently before Congress falls squarely within that protection. Your contempt citation, therefore, appears to be a direct violation of the constitutional separation of powers." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Napolitano stared down at Crockett, his legal mind racing through the implications of what she'd just said. She wasn't just some politician playing lawyer, she was demonstrating a command of constitutional law that rivaled his own. "However, Your Honor, there's something else we need to discuss." She opened her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "Before issuing your contempt citation, did you consider your own statements about voting rights legislation?" "What are you talking about?" Napolitano's voice had lost its authoritative boom, replaced by something that sounded almost nervous. "I'm talking about your appearance on Fox News 3 weeks ago, where you stated, and I quote, 'The Protecting Voting Rights Act is constitutional overreach that will destroy the integrity of American elections.' Did you make that statement?" The courtroom exploded. Republican committee members looked shocked. Democratic members were furious. The media section went into overdrive, reporters frantically typing and making phone calls. Court security moved closer to maintain order as voices began rising throughout the gallery. Napolitano's face had gone completely white. "My previous commentary as a private citizen has no bearing on my judicial duties, doesn't it?" Crockett's voice was razor-sharp now. "Because according to the Judicial Code of Conduct, Canon 2 specifically requires judges to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Publicly condemning legislation and then holding a congresswoman in contempt for defending that same legislation seems to create exactly that appearance." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the next blow. "In fact, Your Honor, weren't you specifically warned by judicial ethics experts that your media appearances might create conflicts of interest when you were confirmed to this position?" But the constitutional arguments were just the opening act. What came next would destroy Napolitano's credibility forever. "Your Honor, there's one more thing." Crockett reached into her briefcase and pulled out a tablet. "Are you familiar with the law firm Brennan and Associates?" Napolitano's eyes went wide. For the first time in the entire proceeding, he looked genuinely afraid. "Congresswoman, I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant because Brennan and Associates has been paid $2.3 million over the past 2 years by the Republican National Committee to challenge voting rights legislation in federal court. And according to financial disclosure forms, you own significant stock in Brennan and Associates." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Republicans jumped to their feet shouting objections. Democrats demanded answers. The media section was in complete frenzy. Court security guards stepped forward, hands moving instinctively toward their restraints as voices rose throughout the gallery. "That's a lie," Napolitano shouted, his composure completely shattered. Crockett held up the tablet, showing financial documents. These are your financial disclosure forms from last year, filed with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Line 47 shows your investment in Brennan and Associates. Should I read the exact amount? She paused dramatically, looking directly at Napolitano. It's $47,000 in stock holdings, Your Honor. Nearly $1 million invested in a firm whose primary revenue stream depends on blocking the very legislation I'm here to support. The silence that followed was crushing. Even the most experienced political observers in the room had never seen anything quite like this. A sitting congresswoman systematically exposing a federal judge's financial corruption in real time. The room was in complete pandemonium now, but Crockett's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Your Honor, you have a direct financial interest in the outcome of voting rights litigation. You publicly condemned the legislation I'm here to support. And when I presented evidence that threatens the legal strategies your investment benefits from, you tried to silence me with a contempt citation. She paused, letting the full weight of her words settle over the courtroom. This isn't about respect for your courtroom. This is about protecting your investment portfolio. The silence that followed was absolutely crushing. Every person in that courtroom understood exactly what had just happened. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended herself against a contempt citation. She had systematically destroyed Judge Napolitano's credibility, his integrity, and possibly his entire judicial career. His face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. But Crockett wasn't finished. Your Honor, I move that you recuse yourself from any further proceedings related to voting rights legislation due to your clear conflict of interest. I also move that my contempt citation be dismissed as constitutionally invalid and ethically compromised. She closed her folder and looked directly at Napolitano. And I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Committee this afternoon. The judge who had started this hearing with complete confidence, who had thought he could silence a congresswoman with the bang of his gavel, now sat in stunned silence as his career crumbled around him. Court is in recess. Napolitano mumbled, practically fleeing from the bench. As he disappeared through the door behind the bench, the courtroom erupted in chaos. But through it all, Jasmine Crockett stood at the witness table, calm and composed. Having just delivered one of the most devastating legal takedowns in modern political history. The gavel had barely stopped echoing when the first tweet went out. A reporter in the gallery had live-streamed the entire confrontation, and within minutes, Crockett destroys Napolitano was trending nationwide. But what happened in the hours and days after that courtroom showdown would reshape not just two careers, but the entire conversation about judicial ethics and voting rights in America. Within 30 minutes of court recessing, the video clips were everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. Every platform was flooded with clips of Crockett systematically dismantling Napolitano's authority. The moment she revealed his financial conflicts became the most watched political video of the week. Watch Congresswoman exposes judge's financial conflicts in real time blasted across CNN's homepage. Fox News found itself in the awkward position of covering their former legal analyst's complete humiliation. MSNBC led with constitutional scholar destroys corrupt judge. But it wasn't just the mainstream media. The clips were being shared by everyone from high school civics teachers explaining separation of powers to constitutional law professors using it as a case study in judicial ethics violations. The most viral clip, watched over 15 million times in the first 24 hours, showed the exact moment Napolitano's face went white when Crockett mentioned Brennan and Associates. Social media users slowed it down, zoomed in, created memes of his expression of absolute terror. The political ramifications were immediate and devastating. Within hours, Democrats were calling for Napolitano's impeachment. Progressive organizations that had been planning routine campaigns around voting rights suddenly found themselves with the perfect symbol of judicial corruption. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "When you come for Jasmine Crockett, you better not miss. This is what happens when you try to silence someone who knows the law better than you do." Judicial corruption exposed in real time. But the response wasn't just from progressive. Conservative legal scholars found themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending the indefensible. Even some Republican committee members who had been in the hearing began distancing themselves from Napolitano. Senator Ted Cruz, never one to miss a political opportunity, tweeted, "While I disagree with Rep. Crockett on policy, judicial ethics must be above reproach. These allegations demand immediate investigation." The White House found itself in the awkward position of commenting on a federal judge appointed by the previous administration. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre carefully stated, "The President believes all judges must maintain the highest ethical standard. These are serious allegations that merit thorough investigation." Republican leadership tried to contain the damage by arguing this was a partisan attack on the judiciary, but their talking points fell flat when conservative legal experts began acknowledging the severity of the allegation. The Federalist Society, normally a reliable defender of conservative judges, notably refused to issue a statement supporting Napolitano. Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe called it the most blatant violation of judicial ethics I've witnessed in 4 decades of legal practice. But perhaps more damaging were the responses from federal judges themselves. A group of federal judges issued an unprecedented joint statement saying they were deeply troubled by reports of potential conflicts of interest and concerned about the impact on public trust in the judiciary. The Judicial Ethics Committee, normally a slow-moving bureaucratic body, announced they would be expediting their review of any complaints against Napolitano. Legal experts noted this was virtually unprecedented. The committee clearly wanted to distance itself from the scandal as quickly as possible. What the public didn't see was the frantic activity happening behind the scenes. Congressional investigators were already pulling Napolitano's financial records. The FBI was beginning a preliminary investigation into potential judicial corruption. The Department of Justice was reviewing whether federal criminal charges might be appropriate. Sources inside the investigation revealed that Napolitano's connections to Brennan and Associates were even deeper than Crockett had revealed in court. The law firm hadn't just paid him dividends. They had apparently been consulting with him on strategy for challenging voting rights legislation. Internal emails obtained by investigators showed Napolitano providing detailed advice on how to craft legal challenges that would be most likely to succeed in federal court. One email, dated just 2 weeks before the hearing, showed him specifically recommending arguments against the Protecting Voting Rights Act. But perhaps most damaging was a series of text messages between Napolitano and senior partners at Brennan and Associates, discussing neutralizing the Crockett problem. The messages, sent just days before the hearing, included detailed background research on Crockett's legal career and suggestions for rattling her composure during testimony. The investigation also uncovered that Napolitano had attended private strategy sessions with Republican operatives where they discussed how to use judicial proceedings to undermine Democratic voting rights efforts. These meetings, held at exclusive Washington clubs, included discussions of which judges might be sympathetic to challenges against voting rights legislation. Federal investigators were particularly interested in a $50,000 consulting fee that Brennan and Associates had paid to a company owned by Napolitano's wife just weeks after his confirmation to the federal bench. The payment, listed as Judicial Education Services, appeared to have no corresponding work product or documentation. Speaking requests from law schools, civil rights organizations, and Democratic groups flooded her congressional office. But more importantly, her confrontation with Napolitano had elevated the entire voting rights issue. Legislation that had been stalled in committee suddenly had renewed momentum. Democrats were using the scandal to argue for stronger judicial ethics requirements. Progressive organizations were using it to highlight the urgent need for voting rights protection. What Jasmine did wasn't just brilliant legal advocacy, said Kristen Clark, head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She showed the American people exactly how the system works against voting rights. She made the abstract concrete. Within 48 hours of the hearing, Crockett had received calls from Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, and Stanford Law School inviting her to give guest lectures on constitutional law and judicial ethics. The American Bar Association extended an invitation for her to deliver the keynote address at their annual convention. Her congressional colleagues were equally impressed. "I've been in Congress for 20 years, said Congressman Jamie Raskin, a constitutional law professor before entering politics, and I've never seen anyone dismantle judicial corruption with such precision. She didn't just win that confrontation, she taught a masterclass in constitutional advocacy. But perhaps the most telling sign of her rising star was the flood of recruitment calls from major law firms offering her 7-figure partnership deals, and from top universities offering her endowed chair position, all of which she politely declined, saying her work in Congress was just getting started. The Napolitano scandal began revealing broader problems with judicial ethics and conflicts of interest. Investigative reporters started digging into other federal judges' financial holdings. Congressional Democrats announced hearings on judicial ethics reform. But perhaps most significantly, The confrontation had changed the conversation about who gets to speak with authority in American politics. Crockett hadn't just defeated Napolitano. She had shown that young leaders, especially young leaders of color, could take on the most established institutions and win. 3 days after the hearing, Napolitano announced he was taking a temporary leave of absence to address the ethics allegations. Legal experts noted that judges almost never take such leaves, unless they're preparing to resign or expecting to be removed. By the end of the week, Brennan and Associates was under federal investigation. 3 other federal judges with financial ties to the firm had recused themselves from voting rights cases. The Republican National Committee was facing questions about their legal strategies and whether they had inappropriately influenced federal judges. But the real victory wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one unethical law firm. Crockett's takedown of Napolitano had exposed the entire network of financial interests working to undermine voting rights. It had shown the American people exactly how money flows through the system to influence judicial decisions. More importantly, it had shown that these systems aren't untouchable. A prepared, knowledgeable advocate can expose corruption and hold even the most powerful people accountable. The Judicial Ethics Committee's investigation is expected to conclude within weeks, with most legal experts predicting Napolitano will be forced to resign. The FBI investigation into Brennan and Associates could lead to criminal charges, and Congress is moving forward with the most comprehensive judicial ethics reform in decades. But perhaps most significantly, Jasmine Crockett has emerged as a new kind of political leader, someone who combines deep legal expertise with fearless advocacy and the ability to communicate complex issues to regular people. She's already being mentioned as a potential Senate candidate, a future presidential contender, and a Supreme Court justice. But regardless of what office she seeks next, her confrontation with Napolitano has established her as one of the most formidable political figures of her generation. The ultimate lesson of this confrontation isn't just about judicial corruption or voting rights, though both are crucially important. It's about the power of preparation, the importance of standing up to authority when authority is wrong, and the reality that in America, truth and facts can still triumph over power and position. Jasmine Crockett didn't just make Judge Napolitano regret his contempt citation. She showed the entire country what real leadership looks like in the 21st century. The question now isn't whether Napolitano will survive this scandal, it's whether the systems he represents can be reformed before more corruption is exposed, and whether other young leaders will follow Crockett's example of fearless, fact-based advocacy. One thing is certain: after watching a 43-year-old congresswoman systematically destroy a federal judge's career in real time, Washington will never look at Jasmine Crockett the same way again. Don't miss what happens next in this incredible story. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay updated on all the latest developments in this scandal that's rocking Washington. Share this video with anyone who needs to see what real accountability looks like. And let us know in the comments, do you think more judges should face this kind of scrutiny? The conversation is just getting started.